first months of 1945, Japan was on the run. The Americans had fought their way across the Pacific. US submarines and aircraft had destroyed Japan's merchant fleet and naval air power. The main Japanese home islands had been cut off from vital supplies of fuel and raw materials. The Japanese were facing defeat. Yet they refused to surrender, convinced that if they fought back with sufficient brutality, the Americans wouldn't have the stomach for the fight and would give in. Japan made clear that every move towards the home islands would be paid for in Allied blood. It presented the United States with a huge problem. How could Japan be defeated without a terrible loss of American life? The country would eventually turn to the most powerful and dreadful weapon ever seen. A weapon that would change the course of war forever. In early 1945, as US military planners considered the next move against Japan, their gaze fell on the Japanese-occupied island of Jima. It lay a mere 800 miles from the Japanese mainland and would be a valuable base for attacking the country. The US commander in the Central Pacific, Admiral Chester Nimitz, assembled the largest landing fleet ever brought together in the Pacific campaign and prepared to invade the island. Nimitz was taking no risks. Wave after wave of American aircraft paved the way with a massive aerial bombardment. Then, on the morning of February the 19th, 1945, the guns of the Naval Task Force began one of the most prolonged bombardments of the war. At the same time, landing craft set off for the shore. The Marines hit the beaches of Iwo Jima along the southwestern shore just after 9 o'clock in the morning. For a few moments there was an eerie calm. The massive naval and aerial bombardment appeared to have overwhelmed the Japanese garrison. Then a hurricane of Japanese fire swept over them. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the Japanese commander on the island, had told his men to hold their fire until the Americans were right under their guns. Now the Japanese opened up from a network of tunnels, caves, and bunkers. There was carnage. But gradually, small groups of US troops inched their way forward. Finally, by the evening, the beachhead had been secured. The task now was to capture the 550-foot-high Mount Suribachi, the heavily defended volcano that dominates Iwo Jima. For 3 days, Marines clawed their way up the steep, pitted slopes. They were supported by a constant air and naval bombardment from the invasion fleet. Finally, on February the 23rd, 1945, a US platoon led by First Lieutenant Harold Schreier began the final assault, carrying with them a small US flag. They reached the summit and raised their flag using a piece of piping as a pole. Marine Corps photographer Staff Sergeant Louis Lowery captured the scene with a few precious photographs. The hard-pressed Marines on the beaches below cheered and wept. Ships sounded their whistles. Three hours later, the event was restaged with a larger US flag. The moment was immortalized by photographer Joe Rosenthal with one of the most iconic photographs of the war. But the battle for Iwo Jima was far from over. The rest of the island was still in Japanese hands. The next day, the Marines captured the first of the island's strategically vital airfields. But Kuribayashi had told his men to take as many of the enemy with them as possible. Their duty to the Emperor to die on the island. It meant each assault became a bloody frontal affair. It took 2 weeks before the remaining 2 airfields on the island were in US hands. Even as the fighting continued, the US Air Force began to make use of Iwo Jima's airfields. During the late spring and summer of 1945, over 2,500 damaged US bombers made emergency landings on the island, often saving the lives of their crews. Finally, at the end of March, after some 6 weeks of ferocious fighting, the last Japanese resistance was snuffed out. But the capture of Iwo Jima had come at a terrible price. Only 200 of the 22,000-strong Japanese garrison survived. The Americans had also suffered badly. Nearly 7,000 Marines had been killed and some 18,000 wounded. The Americans finally had the base they needed, but it was now clear that unless the US could come up with an alternative, any invasion of Japan would be paid for in tens of thousands of American lives.